So I recently conducted a GPI study for South Australia for the previous state government. That was late last year. I was commissioned by the then South Australian government, of course we had a change in the state government, to produce a GPI study for South Australia. And I wrote a very brief report on the GPI results and their significance. And of course that's another document I have here that can be circulated. Do you want me to just... This is the... just have a look at the flick through that, Darren. So it was done in relative hurry. It took about 3 months to do. It's only a very short report, the GPI report for South Australia, but it gives you some insight into what I'm about to say in my presentation. Now, the work involved calculating the GPI for Australia and South Australia. So I didn't just calculate it for South Australia, but also for Australia. And the reason why I did that was that I subtracted the values for South Australia from the Australian values to obtain a GPI measure for rest of Australia. So if you could imagine, Australia is made up of a number of states, just imagine that Australia is made up of 2 states, South Australia and the rest, called rest of Australia. Okay, we wanted to make a comparison between South Australia and rest of Australia. Now that's not a comparison between South Australia and other individual states, but the rest collectively. Then we could compare the South Australia's per capita GPI with its per capita gross state product, GSP, as well as South Australia's per capita GPI with that of rest of Australia. Now, I've talked about the deficiencies of GDP, gross domestic product. Now I'm talking about gross state product. GDP is the standard measure of national income at the national level, GDP. Gross state product is an identical measure at the state or provincial level. And some countries got states and some countries call them provinces. The results indicated that the per capita GPIs of South Australia and Australia were much lower than their per capita GSP GDP values, suggesting that per capita GSP or GDP were overstating genuine progress in South Australia and Australia. So just to give you some insight, I've got here, this is the per capita GSP for South Australia, that's the blue line, and the red line is South Australia's per capita GPI. And you can see it's much lower. And it's not increasing at the same rate. My other diagram I've got here, now that's the red line is South Australia's per capita GPI. The blue line is the per capita genuine progress indicator for rest of Australia. And what it shows is that around about the mid-1990s, South Australia, which previously had a per capita GPI lower than that of rest of Australia, in fact, was much higher and remained higher from about 1997 through to the end of the study period here, which is 2016. Now that's despite the fact that South Australia's gross state product is less than most other states within Australia. Okay? So conventional view would be that South Australia is doing poorly compared to the rest of Australia because it's got a lower per capita GSP. But in fact, the GPI indicates that South Australia is doing better than a place called rest of Australia. I think yes, just to point out, South Australia's per capita GPI increased. So the study period was 1986 to 2016. South Australia's per capita GPI increased by 15% over that period. However, that was half the percentage increase in per capita GDP, or GSP, over the same period. So, as I've pointed out, despite South Australia having a lower per capita GSP and a smaller rate of increase in per capita GSP than the rest of Australia, it had a larger per capita GPI, suggesting South Australia is experiencing a greater rate of genuine progress than the rest of Australia, which cannot be concluded from measures of gross state product. Now, the individual values of the individual GPI items could help. So the spreadsheets have various values for the different items that make up the GPI, and they can be used to explain why, in this case, South Australia appears to have made greater genuine progress than the rest of Australia. So this is just to give you some idea of how the information generated by doing a GPI study can aid policymakers. Not just for South Australia, but it would be a similar case for South Asian countries. The data showed that South Australia has a more even distribution of income than the rest of Australia, which magnifies the consumption benefits in South Australia relative to the rest of Australia. South Australia has a lower cost of living than the rest of Australia, especially housing costs. South Australia has lower per capita environmental costs than the rest of Australia. And that was due to a number of factors: lower rates of native vegetation clearance. In fact, in South Australia, native vegetation clearance is virtually zero. A piece of legislation was enacted about 35 years ago which prohibits the clearance of native vegetation. There's still significant native vegetation clearance in some states in Australia, in particular Queensland and parts of New South Wales and some in West Australia. South Australia uses irrigation water far more efficiently. South Australia relies very heavily upon the River Murray for irrigation water. South Australia is down the bottom end of that river, okay, and as a consequence it has to use the water more efficiently, and it does. South Australia has lower levels of per capita energy use and greenhouse gas emissions than the rest of Australia. And South Australia relies less heavily on non-renewable resource depletion, and by that I mean mining, to finance its consumption. So if you look at states like West Australia and Queensland, one of the main activities that finances its consumption, which is a benefit item, is a negative item, and that's mining, the depletion of non-renewable resources. That's not the case for South Australia. And the reason for that was that one of the other great benefits for South Australia revealed by the GPI study was that the percentage of South Australia's GSP generated from value-adding activities, in other words manufacturing, is much higher than most Australian states. Okay, so South Australia is in effect one of Australia's main manufacturing states, which means it's adding value to real resources, to natural resources, rather than exploiting natural resources to generate income in order to finance consumption. So this means that South Australia is better adept at adding value to resources rather than supplying resources for other states or nations to add value to them, to those resources. From a policy point of view, the study showed that South Australia could widen its advantage over the rest of Australia by doing a number of things. Firstly, exploiting its manufacturing edge to attract and establish high-grade forms of manufacturing. Right, so it has the capacity to attract those high-grade, value-adding forms of manufacturing, given its strong manufacturing base. And continuing its strong transition towards renewable energy sources, South Australia has the highest percentage of renewable resource energy or electricity generation as a percentage of total electricity generation of any state in Australia, which would further reduce environmental costs and attract new forms of investment into the state. And the study also indicated that large-scale resource depleting projects, which have been suggested in the past, such as expansion in mining and oil drilling in the Great Australian Bight. There's a plan to, in fact, explore for oil reserves in the Great Australian Bight, which is a major aquatic reserve for not only most forms of fisheries, but also for whales, the southern right-backed whale, and so forth. It's basically a pristine coastline. These sorts of activities, mining and oil drilling in the Great Australian Bight, would be unlikely to significantly increase South Australia's economic welfare. Just one other GPI study I want to talk about. I've been recently commissioned to conduct a GPI study of Saudi Arabia for an organisation called the Bin Zaga Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And this study provided a wonderful opportunity to assess the genuine progress of a nation that has two major features: has a very unequal distribution of income and relies heavily on the exploitation of a non-renewable resource. What the study showed was that in 2016, Saudi Arabia's per capita GPI was considerably lower than its per capita GDP. So in actual fact, in terms of international dollars, which is a fictitious monetary measurement based on purchasing power parity of individual countries. Saudi Arabia's per capita GPI was 17,000 international dollars per person, despite its GDP being $50,000 per person. So the per capita GDP is 3 times its per capita GPI. So obviously per capita GDP in the case of Saudi Arabia greatly overestimates the genuine progress being achieved in Saudi Arabia. And just to give you some idea of what the diagram looks like for Saudi Arabia, that's for the period 1970 to 2016. Now, the reason for the huge spike, the red line is per capita GDP and the blue line is per capita GPI. And the reason for the huge spike, that was during the 1970s when there was the huge increase in oil prices, which of course boosted the GDP, per capita GDP of Saudi Arabia. It did have a positive effect on the GPI, per capita GPI of Saudi Arabia, but not nearly as much as it did for per capita GDP. You can see throughout the period, the per capita GPI for Saudi Arabia is much less than per capita GDP. And whilst the per capita GDP in the last 20 years or so has basically levelled off, you can see for most of the last 20 years in Saudi Arabia, 25 years, the per capita GPI has fallen. And that's basically it. The aim is to do something similar for South Asian nations. It provides, as you can see, lots of information given what I described and explained with regards to the South Australian GPI study, which can be used by policymakers to design policies that can bring about greater genuine progress within a state, a nation or region. And you can do that because you can identify, because you've got different benefit and cost items, you can identify which items are having the greatest positive effect on the GPI and those which are having the greatest negative effect. You can also, by looking at the data, for example, I mentioned with South Australia that large-scale resource depleting projects, for example mining or drilling for oil in the Great Australian Bight, would not significantly increase South Australia's economic welfare. Why? Well, it might lead to some consumption benefits, but it would also lead to an increase in the cost of non-renewable resource depletion. So one item would go up, the other one would go down, and they'd offset each other, the GPI wouldn't rise. So other forms of activity need to be conducted in South Australia to boost the GPI. An opportunity does exist in South Australia for that, value adding of resources, so not using too many resources but adding value to those resources because of South Australia's strong manufacturing base. That can be gleaned from the information that's generated by calculating the GPI. Can't be gleaned from GDP because if South Australia goes ahead and engages in large-scale mining projects or drilling of oil off the Great Australian Bight, South Australia's GSP will go up, giving the impression that South Australia is better off, where the GPI will indicate that there will be some benefits, but there will be some costs. And overall, South Australia's economic welfare would not rise. So, have people got any questions at all?
There were 2 questions, and one of those which I was also thinking. One is, when you look at the project, like, as you mentioned that there hasn't been any project on measuring GPI in India and like South Asian countries in those areas. One question would be, what is the time frame, because you would be an expert to look at it, to be able to fathom the time frame, how long does it take to measure GPI for a few countries like India and subcontinent? And secondly, in terms of receiving data on like infrastructure and benefits, the social benefits. So how are the data collected?
So, well, I mentioned that I'll use World Bank data. So there's quite a lot of. I need to use a consistent database.
Right.
Because if I don't use a consistent database, it means you can't really make genuine comparisons between countries.